Welcome back to Monster in My Closet, the podcast where we shine a light on the professional world's darker corners. I'm Anil Saxena, joined by my co-host, the founder of Medusas, Morgan Hunter. Each episode, we tackle the fears and faux pas that haunt our work lives, with insights, interviews, and a dash of humor, some stupid analogies, and probably swearing. So if you've ever felt like you're navigating a workplace labyrinth, a never-ending approval process, an evil hall of mirrors, or a constantly ending quarter, you're in the right place. Let's confront those monsters together. Are you ready? Let's begin. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Monster in My Closet. So Morgan, this week, are we scared or scary?
We're scary.
We're scary.
Yes.
We're scary. That's actually kind of refreshing to be scary, because I like being in control or having the perception of being in control. It's always very
You've got all the control and bias on your side, Anil.
Yes. I'm going to mark this day down as an important day that I have control. So this week, the bony finger of bias points at you. Together, we'll confront the wailing specter of workplace bias, hear its chilling cries, learn to recognize its haunting presence, and discover how to soundproof your decision-making from the Banshee of Bias. So 3 big things we want to talk about today: understanding cognitive bias in the workplace, recognizing your own personal bias and looking at techniques and tools for self-reflection to identify your own. And finally, we'll look at strategies for mitigating bias, looking at some practical steps to minimize bias in the workplace. So, Morgan, what is a bias? Why are we even talking about this thing in this podcast today?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a skewed perspective you have on something based on the entirety of your life experience, right? It's your perception of what's going on. And there's dozens and dozens of different biases that you can have based on your life experience. And we're going to unpack some of those today.
Yes. We will unpack them, but we will try to keep them in the box so that we don't open them up too much. But biases are interesting, right? Because they're a shortcut to really making decisions, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Mostly it's unconscious. These really came to the forefront by Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and they won the Nobel Prize in economics for behavioral economics, and really made this whole notion of biases and how they operate in the world a thing that we talk about and we consider. And Daniel Kahneman wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Yeah, that's right. Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a great read, but just know that it's dense. It's a lot like a book from school that you would read, but it is interesting. And we all fall victim to these pretty common biases. Morgan, what are some common cognitive biases, and how do they kind of manifest in the workplace?
Yeah, so there's 3 biases that I picked from the 100 that I thought that I'd seen most often in the workplace. And the first one is illusory correlation, which is perceiving a relationship between variables when no such relationship exists. I feel like I see this in business all the time. In fact, I'm not even sure how they got to that. That must have been caused by X. It's really shocking. For instance, on that one, the whole concept of there's more crazy things happening and more hospital visits on a full moon. Actually, there's been studies that is not the case. It's just that people remember it better when there's a full moon, and they associate those 2 things together. So really, any type of superstitious activity or thinking that you may have is a result of this illusory correlation. And I do have my own superstitions. I'm just going to put that out there. But I'm aware that they are superstitions and that I am subject to this bias. What about you, Anil? We'll bat this back and forth.
Yeah. And that, that actually just makes me think of the whole notion of Mercury and retrograde. I remember Sheree and I signed a contract to buy a house, and Mercury was in retrograde, and people were like, "Well, you shouldn't have signed it then, because now things are gonna, the locusts are gonna come, and you're gonna hate your neighbors and all that stuff." None of that stuff happened, but people did talk about it, and they were very sure. They were very sure. Yeah. So one of the biases that I picked out was the authority bias.
Mm.
And I really feel like this is pretty sinister. It's the notion that someone is right or important, right, because they have a title or money or whatever. So it's a little bit like Gary is a VP and he said that things should go this way, but Gary has no experience in that thing. So it's like, what the actual fuck? Gary's not done that at all. And it plagues our society lately. So people who actually know things are being disregarded because somebody famous disagrees with that, or doesn't feel like that might be the most accurate thing. And we see that at work a lot.
Yeah, there's also not only do people assume that that person knows what they're doing based on where they are in the hierarchy, we also assume they know certain things, right? So, for instance, if Gary suggests something that is illegal, right? And you say, that's illegal. And then someone comes to Gary's defense and says, well, Gary wouldn't suggest something that was illegal, so therefore it's not illegal. I'm like, well, that's not how law works. Maybe we should just educate Gary and give him the rest of the information so he can make an informed decision, right? So it's really nefarious. It's bad thinking. It can result in some really, really risky outcomes and behaviors.
Yeah, yeah. And at work, we've really kind of uncovered this where, you get promoted for things or hired into things that you don't have 100% knowledge about. And because you have that title, it doesn't necessarily equate to you knowing what the fuck you're talking about. I mean, that's reality. And we have to make sure that we're identifying that bias all the time. So, Morgan, what's the second bias that is your favorite?
Outcome bias.
And
this one is judging a decision based on its outcome rather than the quality of the decision at the time it was made. So, to give you an example, let's say you missed a phone call from someone because you were driving, right? And later you find out that that person was in need of help or they were injured or whatever. You can spend a lot of time saying, I should have picked up that phone. I should have done this, blah, blah, blah. Because if I did, this thing would have never happened. Okay, that's an example of that kind of thinking. In reality, you made the very best decision you could in the moment because you were driving and you weren't able to pick up your phone, and there was nothing wrong with the decision you made. But yet we look at that as a bad choice in retrospect. Why I think this is important for work is particularly in the area of failure. So when we do something that doesn't have a great result, we tend to focus on the fact that, well, how did we get here? Blah, blah, blah. We gotta make sure this never happens again. And shame, shame, shame. And it's so horrible, right? It's so horrible. But the reality is, did the person or team make the very best decision they could at the time, given the data that they had? If the answer is yes, we can just stop doing the blame game and stop talking about how we coulda, shoulda, woulda. We made the decision to the best of our ability at the time. And I feel like this type of bias really is hard in an organization because it starts pointing fingers and playing the blame game when in reality everyone's just working with the data that they have.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really critical one because I feel like oftentimes we don't pay enough attention to how we got to the decision that we've made. We just look at the decision and then base our thoughts and how and our perceptions on the steps that we took to get to that decision based on the specific outcome. Um, and the outcome can be influenced by 100 different things, right? So Sheree and I went to this place called White Pie I shouldn't have said the name. I did. It's too late. In Denver, because it was recommended to us for pizza, like best pizza in Denver, and in my opinion, was not because they didn't have red sauce on their pizza. It was just cheese and bread, which
But
I
it's
could
in the
get.
name, it's in the name.
Yeah,
It's the
but
name.
right, and so, but the decision to go there, I didn't like think about all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could have, and so this guy recommended to Cherie that we go there. And so my immediate reaction was throw out everything that guy recommended because that pizza was garbage pizza. But recommendations. But because the outcome wasn't good for me, now Cherie liked hers. But in my movie, my life matters. And so the, those decisions, right? So we do that, and we do that at work a lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? We throw things out because the end product wasn't exactly what we thought it was going to be, even though the end product might work or it might get us up close to the outcome,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think that whole notion, that outcome bias, is a really, really nefarious one. Can I
Mm-hmm.
share my second one?
Absolutely, go for it.
So my second one, sunk cost bias,
Love this one.
right? Love to hate this one. So cost bias haunts me today, right? And sunk cost is the notion that because you put all this effort, time, money into a thing or a decision or a product, you can't give it up now because you already invested in it, right? So I'm going to get the most out of this thing. And so I worked for somebody who created a solution for something and put all their marbles into it, right? All their
Mm-hmm.
political capital, everything they could into it. And it was wrong. Like, just wrong. It was the wrong decision. The thing didn't work. But because they had spent all this money and time on it, they didn't want to abandon it. And really, it made things really, really difficult, right? And it's a little bit like when I put a plant in the garden, um, and and I spent all this time and effort putting it in there. Um, I don't want to rip it out, even if it's not growing in the right way or it's spreading too much because I spent money on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we do this a lot at work, right? We
Mm-hmm.
believe that because we put time and effort into something, that we have to get our return, quote unquote, return on investment. But that's not necessarily the case, right? And it actually costs us a lot by doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's two scenarios with sunk cost. One is you're in the middle of a project, right? And things are getting bumpy. There's a moment there where you can kind of make a choice. Having kind of grown up in IT, I learned very early on that bringing something into the world that doesn't deserve to be there is always going to be way painful later, right? So that just understanding that the pain you're feeling right now is minimal compared to the pain that you will feel if this piece of crap goes to market or whatever, right? So there's that acknowledgement that this is not the road we want to go down. The second thing with sunk cost is, let's say you develop something for a very specific scenario, right? And let's say a year later, your business has changed and you're still using this one thing, whatever it is that you developed for a very specific use case. They're like, well, we spent all this time and money doing this. I'm like, well, the business has changed. You can throw it away now. Right. And I think you also need to be willing with sunk costs to retire things when they have outlived their usefulness. Right. So that they don't become a distraction in the workplace and you can focus on the things that are really going to move your business forward.
Yeah. Such an important thing, right? That whole measure, monitor, and modify, the three M's that I didn't come up with, but I like to coin that: measure, monitor, and modify, because that's always what you want to be doing. And you want to do it frequently, before the project is done, when the project is done, and when the thing is actually live. Because otherwise, what you're going to end up doing is creating workarounds for things that you implemented and trying to make something work that doesn't work, right? Okay, that's my second favorite. What about you, Morgan? What's rounding out the top three for you?
The last one in my top three would be reactive devaluation. So that is devaluing proposals or ideas because they originated from an adversary. I have done this. I'm just going to.
Yes, we've talked about this.
Everything, like, there's just certain people, doesn't matter what comes out of their mouth. Just, no, I reject that. It's a really serious problem. So that's why I wanted, it's so easy to do this. That's why I wanted to talk about it. So there is certainly choices that we made. Like, let's say you have a real Hatfield and McCoy's kind of relationship with someone at work and they have the best idea ever. And you can't even accept that idea because of who it's coming from. And you are not acting in the best interest of the business when that happens, right? But I also like this because I see this also happen if you are associated with someone. So let's say you work for a leader that is a bad leader. They are crap at their job. They love to burn bridges. They are difficult to work with. And so by association, you are now, your ideas and your work is in the shadow of that leader, right? So it's not just you're hurting with this rambunctious behavior. You are also making it difficult for the people to report to you to do their job and interact with folks in other parts of the organization. And the last example on this one, and this is kind of adjacent to the reactive devaluation, but the other thing I see is disregarding people's ideas because they are low on the food chain.
Yeah.
So, the intern makes a suggestion, or the person who's only been with the company has made a suggestion, right? And because they are new to you, their suggestions are not valid, right? Because they just haven't been around the block long enough. So I think that's another thing that we do, this devaluing something based on who the person is, or where they're coming from. And I feel like that's also really dangerous. I've seen some absolutely brilliant ideas come from people that are brand new to a topic or an industry or a company. And we should appreciate those ideas when we hear them.
I totally agree. And I think that's a really good point, that we have to make sure that we're listening to the idea and not necessarily the person that it's coming from, and make a judgment call based on that, rather than the fact that you don't like Gary or something like that, right? Although that does weigh on you because Gary is kind of an asshole, he does have good ideas every once in a while. And those of you that are named Gary that are listening to this podcast, I apologize ahead of time. So
you have a third one too, right, Daniel?
I do have a third one, and it is the bandwagon bias, right? And I just want to call out here that your biases seem very intelligent, and they have very scientific names, and mine sound like simpleton people biases. But we'll leave that alone for another day. That could be a bias on my part. But bandwagon bias is essentially this notion of glomming onto something because other people are doing it or other people are saying it. And it is rampant in organization. It's rampant in our society, but really rampant in organizations. And this is where kind of faulty best practices kind of get implemented into your
Yeah.
organization. Like
Mm.
some leader read a book, like, oh, I don't know, Who Moved My Cheese? And they want to implement all the garbage in that book in your organization. Not that I know from experience, not that I'm speaking from an actual real life example, but just pretending that that could happen. Or things like NPS or employee engagement, all kind of
Mhm.
good, might be good in certain situations, but because they're popular in a couple of instances, they get known as the thing to do. Um, and if you're looking for a real life example outside of work, intermittent fasting is one of them, right? So there's some schmoes out there that talk about intermittent fasting like it's a really good thing to do. And it may be, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but guess what? Neither are they. And so pulling from what's popular in an organization or in an industry and trying to retrofit it into your organization can be exceptionally detrimental.
I saw this so much in my work in governance, risk, and compliance. So when you're in the SaaS game or the data center game, you are constantly doing RFPs, and the world expects you to have certain certifications and auditing best practices, standards in place, etc. And there were so many times where someone would say, "Hey, Morgan, we need to implement ISO because
Yeah,
this customer is asking for it." I'm like, but that doesn't make sense for what we're doing, right? That's just have that conversation with the customer. Here's why that doesn't apply to us. Here are the things we have in place. Mr. Customer, have a nice day. Nope, nope, nope. How about we do a 3-year project to implement like 50 different ISO standards and bring the business to a screeching halt, right?
yeah,
So this kind of over rotation on certifications without even knowing what those standards and certifications are meant to do and when to apply them appropriately. So that's kind of the heavy handed implementation
yeah.
of standards.
Yeah, and
It's a
the
mess.
other one that I'd call out too is the whole notion of stack ranking. So,
Oh,
right, remember this guy Jack Welch? He was the CEO of GE, and oh, by the way, he ran that company into the ground. And just as a point of reference. But yet somehow we have this belief that because he did that thing, he implemented this stack ranking where essentially it's, you rank people and those people that fall at the bottom of this arbitrary bell curve, you get rid of. Um, and because he did that and it kind of worked for his organization, I would argue that it would or did, but
you had a lot of crap employees to start with.
yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right.
I mean, seriously, stack ranking sucks when you have top performers, when you are like really driving high performance teams. It's just, I can't even.
Yeah. And so there's all kinds of badness around that. But that's another idea of the bandwagon bias or bandwagon effect. So what are some things that people can do as individuals to identify their own biases?
I think one of the things that is helpful for me is to have a little time in my decision making. So if there's something of great importance where a decision needs to be made, and it's like, Morgan, what do you think about this? If it's a big decision, I'll say, I'll tell you tomorrow. I need to sit on this overnight. And that's where I kind of parse through. What am I bringing to the table in terms of bias? What are the pros and cons of this decision moving forward, etc. So I think sometimes just not responding immediately
Mm,
is a good first step.
yeah.
Uh, I think the other thing that I would say is making, normalizing the practice of exploring bias. So just actually say, what bias are we bringing to the table? Here's the direction we want to go. What bias are we bringing to the table? And just beat it up a little bit. And
Yeah.
then break down the bias and adjust for it. Or you can still do the thing, right? If the data is still good after you do the debiasing exercise, but I think you just need to say it out loud. What bias am I bringing to the table? What bias are you bringing to the table?
Yeah.
And are we still good with our decision based on that?
I think that's awesome. And so, right, as an individual, you want to kind of review your decision and look for those patterns and maybe ask a trusted advisor, right? As an individual, I might do that, right? You and I did that a lot when we worked
Mm,
together. And I talked to my wife. I'm sure you talk to your husband, and you just bounce things off of people to bring a different perspective. And
mm-hmm.
I mean, I think for organizations, it feels like, right, don't make, like we were talking about, like don't make decisions in groups. Like don't try to have a big decision in the moment, or we want to give people time to reflect. And then you want to kind of you want to debias things, right? Like do a post-mortem to really figure out, like, how do we get to this decision and why did we make it? And what's the data that we used to make this decision? I think the other thing that an organization could do would is to use more data, right? Like really base your decisions on facts and not feelings, right?
Yeah,
That's really important.
I think data and also people outside your group. And again, I suck at this. Because if I get 6 adults to agree to something and someone says, maybe we should check with this other department and see what their opinion is on this topic, I'll be the first person to say, no. We all know this is a genius idea, but I'm wrong. I'm wrong in that. You should get outside your bubble, right? Outside your little bubble and talk to other people in your business or mentors that you have, or people in other industries. My gosh, there's been so many brilliant ideas that I've been able to bring to bear from industries that aren't even related to the industry I'm working in. And I just I feel so giddy when I was like, oh my gosh, this was something that they do in medicine and I was able to apply it to IT and it works great. So I think being brave enough to put an idea out there and let people that aren't necessarily your friendlies beat it up a little bit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I do that a lot, right? Like I try as hard as I can to bring in people that I know are not going to like the idea. And, or I bring in operations folks who are
Mm-hmm.
going to kind of pick at how is it going to work. And I think that that's a really good way to do it. I think the only other two that I would add are maybe track the success of your decisions and rate them, right? Like to kind of look at what decisions did we make and what was the success rate of them. And then the last one is increase operational efficiency. So I know this sounds kind of like, why does that have anything to do with decision making? If your operations are exceptionally inefficient, it is very hard to drive good decisions because you're always thinking about how it's going to break in the current world. And you can't scale, you can't drive orders of magnitude, you can't leverage efficiencies.
Is
When
that
you,
the we suck bias? Is that, I feel like that's what I'm hearing. But I totally agree. I mean, I have heard this so many times in my job. Well, that's a great idea, except for
yeah,
operationally, we suck and we'll never be able to pull it off. It's like, whoa, yeah, that's the we suck bias. That's what that is.
good one, everyone.
Yeah,
For those
yeah.
that
That's what Anil's saying. Don't suck.
don't suck, the don't suck bias. Well, I definitely feel a little less scary now that I have all these biases out in the open. I don't know about you, Morgan, if you're feeling a little better about the world.
I feel like I need to check myself on the daily for my biases. And I think for our listeners, in our show notes, always check out our show notes. We are going to be listing dozens of biases that you can look at and examples of those biases so you can identify those in your thinking or in group thinking and combat those.
Yeah, yeah, and we're also going to identify some ways to overcome them.
Yes.
And we hope that this has helped you feel a little less scary, a little less scared in your workplace. And thank you for listening to another episode of Monster in My Closet. And we'll see you next week.
Bye.
As we wrap up another episode here at Monster in My Closet, we want to thank you, our fearless listeners, for joining us on this journey of exploring what scares us or when we're scary. Professionally, of course. Together, we've ventured deep into the workplace wilderness armed with humor, insights, and a touch of irreverence, and hopefully learned something together along the way. But our journey doesn't end here. Monster in My Closet is proud to be part of Medusas.org. Medusas is a membership-driven, non-profit organization serving underrepresented groups, minorities, and individuals with disabilities who are doing business in the software as a service space. We're a community created by SaaS professionals, for SaaS professionals, and even the SaaS curious. Visit Medusas.org to discover how you can contribute to a movement that empowers professionals to face their workplace monsters head on. Don't forget to subscribe, share with your colleagues, and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us shine a light on the monsters lurking in the professional closet, making our community braver, stronger, and a little bit wiser. Until next time, keep challenging the status quo, embrace the journey, and remember, no monster is too big when we face it together. Cheers.